Welcome to the Battles We Pick podcast, where advocates and organizers talk about their work pushing for social, political, and policy change. Today's guest is Adotei Akwei of the U.S. branch of Amnesty International. Having served many roles in the organization over the years, Adotei is currently responsible for its work with its membership base. This puts him on the organizing and movement building side of our field after many years doing insider advocacy, particularly to press for a more human rights focused U.S. policy in Africa. We talked about how these two sides of the work relate to each other, and Adotei shared lessons from his work on the issues of conflict diamonds and child soldiers. We also talked about what America's racial reckoning means for an organization like Amnesty and the work needed to make it more inclusive so it looks more like our diverse multiracial country. The first bunch of episodes of this pretty new podcast all feature people I know. So I'm starting off each episode by saying how I know them, and I'm going to do that till I run out of people I know. It's been nearly 30 years, Adotei, since Adotei Akwei and I were tag team mentors to someone, Sandra Malone, who went on to do pretty great things in our sector. Adotei is a seasoned and accomplished human rights advocate who has spent the large part of his career with Amnesty International. Welcome, Adotei, and thanks so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Happy to be here, David.
I've copped to the fact that I do pre-interviews, and in fact, we did one just now. I want to start with what we were just discussing about the complementary pieces of advocacy versus organizing. The latter being more of a movement building, power building, mobilization. I've been thinking about this complementarity as being connected with what's needed to achieve smaller versus larger strides of change. And as we were just talking, you've been very conscious of that and in fact have moved within your own functions and your job in terms of relating to those two pieces. Talk, if you would, about the two different kinds of work.
Sure. I think that they are two complementary and interlinked tactics or approaches to achieving social change. Advocacy, lobbying for some people is sometimes thought of as the art of working within the policy decision maker framework where you are hard-nosed, you have to be tactically flexible, you have to have a long-term strategic vision in terms of what compromises are necessary to advance the ball down the field, so to speak, and also what is viable. And those are necessarily because the actor, in this case, government, is an essential agent of social change that has to be involved. Many people are so suspicious or wonder, well, why do you work with the U.S. government? What's the partnership? You're being taken over. And my answer is, one, this is the entity that has the resources and the responsibility. Two, it can achieve impact at scales that we cannot. And three, government left to its own devices can sometimes lead to very bad consequences. You do not want to do that. So that tactical, strategic approach is absolutely essential for working with the institution of government. But the other part of, or the other approach of movement building, grassroots power, organizing, is the essential brick and mortar of social change. It's essential because in the United States, that's how you actually get policymakers to do the right things. They can look at a report, they can have a meeting, they can go attend an event and think, oh, this is incredible. I want to be a part of it. I want to introduce the legislation. But it's actually constituent activism, or excuse me, educated and targeted constituent activism that in the end drives behavior of our decision makers, certainly on the legislative side, and arguably also on the executive branch side. Um, but that part, I think, is one of the reasons why you have why it's so important to have movement building and organizing as as an essential tool. But the other, I think, is also very deep. Is that without those kinds of movements, or without that kind of organizing, one does not get the transformative educational spark that really leads to a people demanding change and feeling their own place in that change, or holding their leaders accountable. And I think that that's why both of them have to happen. Both of them have to be interconnected. Ideally, when they are, one drives, they each contribute and help each other achieve progress. But it most of the time, people do one or the other, and do not appreciate, hold one in contempt or suspicion, and focus on the other.
I like that way of putting it, government left to its own devices, because I think that points toward a baseline. It acknowledges that government's going to be doing something. Right? There's a status quo ante before we advocates come in to say what we think they should do. And so if you know, there's kind of an imperative to engage to affect what they do,
Yeah,
right? But then going on from there, as you say, um, the sort of the juice, the impact, um, the weight that you bring to bear, of course, affects how significant a change will be accomplished, and at a certain point, uh, you know, you there's things that you can make happen, you know, bringing a constituency, bringing some power, that you can't without that. You know, the either the resistance or the inertia will thwart you. But that and then, you know, sorry if I'm repeating. Just wanted to kind of see these pieces fitting together. Um, then the point about voices of affected people is, you know, then that's where equity comes in, right? To make sure that it's um, the wishes, desires, interests, needs of affected people are there. Um, so so as you've navigated the work that you do, right, as you have sort of shaped your job description, your role in the organization, you were saying that you wanted to kind of make a shift and focus more on one than the other, but that, as you're just saying, you're very mindful of how the two go together. Could you talk some more about that?
sure, sure. Um, I as I you correctly recounted, um, I've been doing this now for about 30 years.
You didn't have to come out.
No, I am. I'm now. I use the term fondly. I'm a dinosaur in my organization, but a fondly regarded dinosaur. And uh, and have been very much in one one camp benefiting from the other, and that has been obviously in the lobbying and advocacy work, and learning how to navigate, how to push, how to negotiate, how to strategically use information um, uh, within the policy frame arena in Washington, and that in itself has shaped, you know, uh, the approach, how one approaches the U.S. government, and it, I can remember one campaign in particular with some very very smart and dear friends now on the trying to get the U.S. government to ratify the optional protocol to end the use of child soldiers, and we were we had a great campaign. We had, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, the Stimson Center, and a couple of, a good strong group, and we were fighting an uphill battle, even though there seemed to be no real moral basis on which to say, no, you have to allow the use of child soldiers. But we were running into a particular senator named Jesse Helms, who in his day was legendary of being able to stop government and hold government frozen. And we spent over a year trying to get a meeting with his office. And when we did, we convened very, very quickly. We literally said, okay, we have maybe 5 minutes to make our point. This is, and I know, David, you will remember this very well, where you like, okay, this is the elevator pitch. If you don't make the pitch before the doors open and close, you basically blown the meeting. And so we assigned, everybody had a bullet point to convey, and we saved our 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 secret bullet point for the last. And we went through all of the different conventional. This is the international community and the UN have designated the age of children to be, too young to fight. We went through that. We went through, all sorts of other arguments. And then the final one was we made, and the staff person we were meeting with barely acknowledged that we were in the room as we were reciting these. And we got to our
This
last
would,
person.
okay, you're having said that this would not have been Mark Lagon then.
I do not know. I don't believe it was
No,
Mark. No,
it wouldn't.
no.
Mm-hmm.
But the final point was that a study had recently been released showing that U.S. servicemen hesitated when faced with children using guns, and that increased the risk of them being injured. And the staffer looked up and said, "That's interesting. Tell me more." It's stunning, but that was indeed what we may falsely or correctly attribute the change and the release, or the end of the opposition on the legislation. But it illustrated really how messaging and has to, you speak to an audience, and the audience, and you have to speak in the language that the audience hears. And so that kind of experience with the U.S. government takes, I think, takes years, or it takes time, and it takes exposure. The audience on the other side, though, of movement building is about idealism. It's about achieving change. It's about showing up and connecting, and about linking the well-being and security and dignity of others that you know you're never going to meet with your own, and yours with theirs. And that linkage then allows it establishes a baseline of acceptable behavior for them as well as for yourself. And I think that has been one of the things that has kind of driven me into this area of more movement building and of organizing. In other words, how do you um, not only build a quote unquote political machine, a movement that can put pressure when pointed in the right direction, but how do you build a movement that has a certain that takes on an awareness of why it's important to show up, why is it important to support, why is it important to engage in politics, and of course to reject the worst behaviors and policies. And I think that this is where late in my career, I feel that this is an equally important part of this is a actually this is an incredibly important battle because um, we now know governments are fickle. They can look at policy that was the rule 10 years ago by a different administration and say no. They can go back on agreements. They can go back even to unsign their signatures on international conventions, things that really do shake and tear the fabric of this global community. And I think that has also been one of the reasons why I've thought this is a new place. This is an important place to engage in and to see how you can build sustainable social change and power and a movement that really does not accept abusive behavior.
I mean, you can look at craftily finding ways to get things through, within those narrow confines of the status quo. And I think that is important. You're saying that, depending on who you are, I guess, right? It's not always uplifting. um, and that it's over in the movement building side where you give voice more towards that idealistic vision, um, which is interesting. I mean, therein lies the complementarity, I suppose, right?
Indeed, it does because I think at least in this in human rights work, quote unquote, um, the for much of the last 25 years, the focus has been on places and peoples and issues that seem far away and certainly beyond the reach of someone living in Chevy Chase or in Des Moines or something. And so that you really not only need to develop a human link, which I think is, and one of the tactics, of course, of that is having individual cases or highlighting stories, so that there's a human connection. But it's also connecting them to an idea that they're part of something bigger than themselves, and that they're connected with people who also believe the same thing, and will show up and you have each other's back. And so that kind of idealism is absolutely essential. It's and I but I also understand that has to be grounded in educated idealism. In other words, some framework of no, we cannot you can't do that, or that's not possible, but this is that kind of thing. But certainly, the the you need that also to even have people feel comfortable in trying to get their policymakers, their elected officials, to do the right thing. There's a certain amount of reverence, excuse me, not reverence. There's a certain amount of deference.
So it's one thing for Adotei and David to see these as complementary, but let's kind of now get real that there's a lot of tension, and the tensions have to do with um, so ambition is, I think, the
Yes,
key watchword here, right?
yeah,
That idealists wanting more and um, not appreciating the difficulty that's entailed in getting less, um, and picking up, I think, on what you were saying a moment ago. Um, yeah, the sensitization, or whatever you want to call it, I guess, is about acknowledging that mobilization gets you more and doesn't get you everything, right? And understanding um, the sort of what traffic will bear, or what's reasonable to expect can be achieved. We were talking about that process of um, you know, building and at the same time tempering expectations. Is it?
yes, yes. There was there's the example that I think changed me the most. You recall there was a terrible civil war in Sierra Leone in the late 90s into the early 2000s, where there was an armed group called the Revolutionary United Front that was committing atrocities funded on the illicit trade in diamonds. And we, everyone knew that this was how they were funding it, but nobody knew what to do, or people knew what to do but weren't sure how to do it. And then into this space, a couple of organizations decided that they wanted to do something that people laughed at and said, you want to take on the diamond industry, which was at that point opaque and powerful, and not linked to this illegal illicit trade. So we the NGO community developed a fairly smart campaign, because I think it was shaped by people who actually understood the international trade and the agreements, and told us about the markets and what would happen. And by happenstance, um, there were already people in Congress who were upset about this, and so were already proposing legislation that probably didn't really have much of a chance, because the industry was obviously represented by very effective lobbyists. All of those forces came together, and the organizing and the grassroots seized upon this, and we had a truly strong national campaign to pass legislation, um, and we're we're doing our outside game and lobbying Congress, and and also lobbying putting pressure on the industry. And then members of Congress, allies, and congressional officers said the only way you're going to get anything is if you work together. And we looked and said, you want us to work with the diamond industry? and I was like, I don't think my NGO colleagues would ever speak to me again. I was truly taken aback. And they said, do you want something or nothing? And I said, I'll go back and consult. And the steering committee of the campaign had a very, very long, like, listen, we have one bite at the apple. What do? We have to bring our groups along, and so but and that involved literally. In this case, it wasn't it was more than tempering their it was educating them about the need for the quote unquote actor to be perceived in a more sophisticated manner, and to realize that that progress has to happen in the industry for you to impact the industry from the outside. In other words, both forces, all of those forces need to work. And I ended up lobbying alongside a lobbyist hired by Tiffany's. And, and it was
because the outcome, if I'm remembering right, is a system and a process for uh, verifying
certification.
the
Yes,
sourcing and certifying, right?
exactly. Yes. And had they not, had the industry not implemented that process, the U.S. market would have basically been shut off to them, which would have, which was the largest market for uncut and finished stones.
I mentioned the individual through whom we know each other, and you were Sandra's mentor, and then I was, and then there she went. But in terms of substance, yeah, I spent a chunk of the '90s deeply involved in these different crises in different parts of Africa, all the more so a bit to the east in the Great Lakes region of Central
Yes.
Africa. And I'm just going to pause for a moment to remember someone, because if I think the greats at this work, Alison Desforges comes to mind.
Oh, yes. Yes.
The little bit that I got to see her operate, I feel like I was watching, a top of the game advocate.
Yes. Yeah. No, Allison was not just brilliant, but she was also very human. In other words, she interacted with people in a way that was never condescending, even if she knew three times as much as the other person was talking about, and she was unwavering in her compass. She was one. Yeah, absolutely right. One of the people that you do say this person was a role model that
Right?
many would do well to
Best of the
try to
generation
emulate.
type thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Um, and to tell listeners a little bit more about who we're talking about, um, there was uh, there was one American whose connection to what was happening in the Rwandan genocide um, was closer, was more real time, was more deeply informed of what happened. And then um, she goes on to produce an authoritative document about the genocide and what happened, for which she was recognized as a MacArthur genius. You were telling the story of, I think that's the essential situation that advocates, maybe advocates and organizers, find ourselves in constantly. What's the what can be hoped for? What can be achieved? You know, how far is it possible to go? With a given issue, with a given problem.
This is the eternal question we grapple with, because um, there are, you know, we go into a social justice or um, a human rights, or or an issue and we want to stop, to correct, and to have some restorative um, impact. Um, and um, I think our experience, our careers have shown that you rarely get all of those, and sometimes you get only minimal amounts of each one. Um, and even the conflict diamonds legislation and the Kimberley process that was created by the diamond industry as a result of this campaign, which was considered a success at the time, it didn't deliver. The NGOs quickly pulled out of it because there was no effective enforcement of the Kimberley process standards. So does that mean that the effort was a failure? Absolutely not. Because it changed the way people thought about diamonds. It changed the diamond industry. It registered on the governments that produce diamonds, and the United States actually played a role in enforcing that moment of accountability. But I think where what I've tried to use as criteria on where to settle has been, one, has there been a genuine airing and discussion and opportunity for the impacted communities to have their time to talk about what they have gone through and what they want, so that even if we don't reach that, it's there for the record. I think the other is to build an awareness and a capacity for justice at some point later. And I think this is something that you're aware of, that human rights is the business of the long game. Are there structures to enforce accountability? Not at the moment, but we gather evidence and protect evidence so that when that institution does exist, there can be some justice, some accountability. It is not robustly satisfying, but it is indeed where for me personally, it's a minimum below which I think I would consider not reaching that to be a failure. Um, but I do think that we our our most our important work is building behind us as we go forward, so that there are people behind us who can take the ball further down the field and ask more demanding questions and ask more, and push for more. This does not happen in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and it's but each step in the right direction builds. That for me, that's how I approach it, and that's what I try to work towards. But maybe it is a personal thing that we're talking about. In other words, what is your comfort level, or no? I don't know.
So, first, let me say that talking about these things is exactly why I wanted to do this podcast, and then go from there to talk about how the things that you just said are a great indication of how complicated this business is. Okay? So, very simplistically, you could say you need to get something on the agenda before you can get it accomplished. And often you need to get some sort of narrative reframing of the issue to give it the oomph to get onto the agenda to be decided, right? Step one, step two, step three. Except You just told the story of an instance where the the building of the narrative with its pull, with its resonance, with its salience was being done simultaneously with getting it teed up for decision. And your sense that whatever the problems with implementation, that um, the drawing that attention, that forcing that thinking about supplies of mineral resources um, was a durable outcome, even with the disappointment in how the Kimberley process was implemented. Um, you talked about the value of opportunities to really feature and highlight voices of affected people. Um, so I just think that's a great example of how these things kind of play with each other, and yes, the outcome, the decision, the change is the point. Um, but you don't stop there, right? No, it's
No.
like there's more to it than that.
Yes. Yes. No. You don't stop there. Um, and I think this is one of the interesting things about our work is that we don't reflect. We are constantly fighting the next battle or or trying to survive the next threat. We seldom reflect on what has happened until it comes up in a discussion such as this.
Boy,
Or
that's something I'd like to change.
yes, yes. Well, I mean, it's actually even funnier because every now and then I will get a request for an interview, and it's not for the media. It's for a student who's doing research on something, and the first thing is, and what is this pertaining to? Oh, it's about something in Africa, da 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 da, and then you're in it, and they said, "Do you remember when you said A B C D?" And you're like, no. But in other words, it is funny that you're constantly hopefully planting seeds as you go along, but without question you don't stop there. You mentioned the work on conflict minerals that resulted following the Kimberley process. Absolutely incredibly important, and still incredibly important to this day because of the issues continue. The work on child soldiers is as relevant today, and transparency, capacity building to monitor lobbying of governments that do training with governments that use underage youth continues. And in the process, you're also building up a network of capacity that ideally will not be seen as quote unquote a traditional rights group, but as a security focused rights group that may not be as threatening to a foreign military, and thereby be able to actually say, you should really think about trying something different. Why this is creating problems for you. This kind of the evolution of the advocacy rights organization demands offering some solutions to these government entities. One of the there was for 5 years I had the luck of working for CARE from 2005 to 2010, which was, as you can it was such a different experience, and I was there to work on advocacy in the out of the regional office in Bangkok, and I was working with different CARE offices. And one of the fascinating things I saw them doing was that they were creating both demand and supply. by empowering and supporting communities that were demanding services, and also working with government agents that were supposed to provide the services and trying to get them to work together. And I thought, what a fascinating model. Here you are helping articulate the basic needs that this community must have, and here you are trying to help the government respond to that, and everybody moves forward. If you can move it together, that's the kind of
I,
thing that you're talking. Yeah, the one of the more interesting campaigns I worked on was the arms trade treaty, the global arms trade treaty, where you know NGOs and governments were lobbying together alongside each other, um, in an effort to try to get as strong as possible a text. And it was fascinating. It really was, and it I don't know whether I've seen that kind of clarity and coming together of a core group of governments pulling along other governments. And there were always outliers, but um, the focus was on the five big largest arms manufacturing and exporting countries to basically not water down or kibosh a treaty that was meaningful. And that meant all of these different other governments and NGOs sharing intelligence, coordinating advocacy. It was a fascinating experience, something that needs to be replicated, unfortunately, much, much more.
but nuclear arms control is where I started. Um, and I think I understand you making a point about all of these are almost always questions of levers on the problem. What's the leverage over the problem? And what's interesting about arms control, I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, is how very directly those kinds of regimes and agreements, um, get their hands on the problem. Right? It's a very tight relationship
Yes.
between problem and solution.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I saw last week there was the new convention against mass atrocities and war crimes was just adopted, and I thought that was obviously a huge step forward, but um, you know our challenge is trying to stop the abuses before they get to that scale. In other words, when you get to having to deal with a war crime, um, then we basically failed the impacted population.
Right. Something else we were talking about before in our pre-interview was the relationship between uh, domestic issues and international issues. Um, the questions of rights, equity, discrimination in the United States versus other places around the world. Um, of course, Amnesty as a legacy organization being associated more with the former, more with the outward looking. Um, but please say more, if you would, about that relationship, about um, the sets of issues and how they relate to one another.
Sure. Um, the organization was, of course, when it was founded, had very clear prohibitions on domestic issues, with a couple of exceptions, working on capital punishment, and working on some uh, refugee and asylum issues, and then, of course, special exceptions for initiatives. But by and large, Amnesty sections globally were not supposed to work on domestic issues. That starts to break down very sharply in the 1990s, 2000, and more so in the 2000s, and very sharply in following the Trump election here in the United States. I think it was happening in other parts of Amnesty in different parts of the world, but most dramatically, the the so-called front line on issues was suddenly here in the United States as well as being abroad, and that was a huge sea change for our membership and for the organization, and that led to a I think a a long due recognition that power depends on to some extent on legitimacy and relevance, and that legitimacy and relevance meant that one could no longer say we do not work on domestic issues because the audience and the people here were fighting injustice and felt that they needed to be a part of that fight here as well as internationally. Now, I think that there were people who always said, absolutely, this connection shouldn't be downplayed or it shouldn't be constrained, um, and that in fact this is the area of comparative advantage in that Amnesty has a global presence. We have Amnesty people working on gun violence in Kenya and Brazil, as well as here in the United States. We have people working on abortion rights and sexual and reproductive rights across the world, including in the United States. We have staff working on refugee and migrant rights issues and asylum threats to it in the Middle East, in Africa, and on the border here in the United States. So the logic and the reality is so powerful that one almost feels, well, this policy should have been jettisoned a while ago. But the bottom line is that it has now, and I for one feel that this is not just the right thing to do; it's actually the most tactically powerful thing to do because lessons learned, support from each other, going in both directions, and principles, upholding principles is much harder to do when they're eroded in one place and suddenly they can those that rolling back can be copycatted in another country. So that I think that's the first thing on the domestic and international connections, and this is now reflected in our agenda here in AI USA. The other, I think, which is equally pressing, is this issue of discrimination and diversity, um, because one, if one is in the United States, one tends to think of this as a uniquely American problem when it's not. It is a it manifests itself in different ways. The United States discrimination issues are have unique aspects to them, and you have issues of, for example, issues of slavery in Mauritania, even though it's been banned dozens of times, at least 4 or 5 times since I worked at Amnesty International, and yet the practice continues. You have discrimination against happening in Tunisia by the president, who is trying to expel African immigrants of quote unquote sub-Saharan Africa, out of his country. Um, and those and those challenges, um, for example, or even connected to, let's use the example of policing, policing in the United States, and how it's applicable to people of color, and how it's applied in other countries against not people of color, but people from lower economic strata. Um, they're catching hell just as much as the people here are, who are on the wrong side of the quote unquote the wrong side of the color line here in the United States. And I think that I think is another big evolution that is happening in my organization. But I think it's also something that is happening in as the United States goes into hopefully a period of real growth. And uncertainty, no question about it, but growth in terms of trying to live up to the promise and the principles that the country was supposedly founded on. And I think that this is probably, in my opinion, the a huge challenge for the U.S. global foreign policy machine in having to change its model of try and be like us to we are grappling with our challenges just like you are, and this is what we're trying to do. It's a much more honest, it's a much more inclusive dialogue, and it's one that will resonate more with amongst people in other parts of the world. But it's also the one that is hardest to give up, and I think
I mean, it echoes the Cold War, where the dynamic was similar. I was acknowledging on an episode that I recorded earlier today, and seems appropriate to do so again. Wind the clock back a little less than 40 years, and I, as a white guy, was not competing with the full set of people who might have been interested in this work if the country had gotten further, right? Because our field had so many more people who look like me and so fewer people who look like you than was accurate representation, or hopefully as close to today. I really liked your point about legitimacy, and particularly the way that you drew that parallel between an organization and the country. And here's what I see in that: that organizations, even individual advocates, the same thing is true as for nations when it comes to legitimacy and credibility. That in the dynamic, never mind what the issue, right? The most essential thing you must have is credibility,
mm,
right? So that you can be taken at your word, be seen as a good, honest player, and legitimacy as it relates to not being hypocritical, right? And just I kind of wanted to go back to that and what you were saying, because I do think that that's like the first condition at all these levels.
yes, it is. And for you mentioned early on that Amnesty is it's a legacy organization, but it was formed in the 1960s, predominantly, exclusively, arguably, by white middle class people in Europe and in the United States, and it's a membership organization, and its strength and durability has been based on the cohesion of that membership and them staying true to their commitments. But that has also led to a need to diversify, and to diversify rather significantly, so that it's appealing, so that its legitimacy on working on justice issues in the United States, as you said, is credible, is seen, and is based on an experience of the partners that we work with, what our membership, what our staff looks like, um, and it's the irony, of course, is that the U.S. Amnesty in the U.S. is just a branch of a global movement, and the global movement is probably actually larger of non-European and Caucasian people than it is, and yet it doesn't matter. The perception is that this is indeed an organization that is, from the not just white, but from the 1960s, and so this diversification is actually on age, it's on ethnic diversity. It's not, in other words, it's got a lot of diversifying to do. But the good news is that it's now an urgent priority for the organization that has realized that this needs to happen for us to be for us to actually walk the talk of our language.
The reckoning is unfinished business. We're back for another round because the previous rounds didn't fully take account of where this country was and what it is. We were talking before about reflection, and I've ended up in a role sort of on the evaluation side of the field that's very much about that, and trying to open space for more reflection. But perhaps above all, I mean for this podcast to be an outlet for that. And thank you so much for going there with me and sharing so much of the wisdom and insights that you've accumulated over a number of years that we really don't need to specify.
David, it's been a pleasure. It's not only been stimulating discussion, but of course, always good to be reconnected with a good friend from, even though we have not been, interacting that much. But yes, this is the kind of reflection and discussion that we need more of. Yes, but it's been my honor and my pleasure.
You tell a friend, I'll tell a friend.
Yes,
listeners should
absolutely.
tell a friend.
Yes. All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.